I'm Barbara Brody. Charlotte Flowery and I are today's co-hosts, and we want to thank you all for being here. If you are a guest today and would like to get involved with Oceanids, please go to our website, Oceanids at UCSD.edu. Oceanids is a social and service organization of UC San Diego. It was started in 1952 as Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We give graduate fellowships and support other undergraduate and postdoctoral activities and welcome newcomers to the campus as I was welcomed many years ago by Oceanids. Sounding Boards is a series of 7 lectures during the academic year presented by eminent experts. Today, we are honored to have Judge Margaret McKeown as our speaker. She has a very distinguished and fascinating biography. Here are a few highlights. She has served more than 25 years as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an affiliated scholar at the Center for the American West at Stanford University, and a jurist in residence at the University of San Diego School of Law, amongst other things. As a former White House fellow, she served as a special assistant at the White House and as a special assistant to the Secretary of Interior. Judge McKeown's recently published book is entitled "As Citizen Justice: The Environmental Legacy of William O. Douglas, Public Advocate and Conservation Champion." Judge McKeown graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and holds an honorary doctorate from there. She is a trailblazer in many realms, including becoming the first woman partner at her former law firm, to being part of the first American group to Shishapana Mountain in Tibet. She's a member of the Judicial Conference of the United States Committee on Judicial Conduct and Disability, appointed by Chief Justice Roberts. She was previously chair of the Judicial Conference of the United States Committee on Code of Ethical Conduct. She chairs the Ninth Circuit Workplace Environment Committee and is a member of the National Workplace Conduct Working Group. She's on the Council of the American Law Institute, the Judicial Advisory Board of the American Society of International Law, and the editorial board of Litigation magazine. She also served as the chair of the ABA Commission on the 19th Amendment, past president of the Federal Judges Association, managerial board of the International Association of Women Justices. She received awards from the ABA, among many other distinguished professional awards, as well as the Girl Scouts Cool Woman Award. Judge McKeown is on the board of the World Justice Project and is vice chair of the ABA Rule of Law Initiative and a current special advisor. She has lectured throughout the world on international law, intellectual property, human rights, ethics, and constitutional law, and has participated in numerous rule of law initiatives with judges and lawyers. She has published widely in the areas of technology, ethics, and international law. Her very timely topic for today's talk is Global Challenges to Democracy: Reflections from 3 Decades of Rule of Law Engagement. There will be questions at the end, and you can put questions in the chat at any time. Please join me in welcoming Judge McKeown. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to my good friend, Barbara Brody, for inviting me. It's my first time to know about this group, so I read up on you, which was interesting. So I've done a lot of different things in my legal and judicial career, but I think near and dear to my heart has been the international work. And of course, as you know, headlines warning about the decline in democracy and the failure of democracy are just a constant drumbeat in the media right now. Of course, it's been in decline, that is democracy around the world, at least for the past decade. And I've been fortunate in the last 3 decades to work with judges, lawyers, and governments around the world on rule of law issues. So then you say, well, what is rule of law? We use it a lot. The press uses it a lot. But we don't really consider, what does it mean? So I would say it's more than a catchy-feely, nice feeling phrase. It really embodies the spirit of a transparent and fair judicial system. It reflects democracy, tolerance, fairness, and freedom, all of values that we prize. So it might not surprise you, but there's no uniform definition of rule of law, despite the fact that you see it all the time. So it was first popularized by a British scholar in the 19th century. And I want to emphasize one thing. When I say rule of law, I don't mean rule by law. So it's not just having a legal system or a set of laws on the books, because that doesn't really guarantee anything. And maybe the best example is Russia. Beautiful constitution, well delineated powers, and plenty of follow-on laws, but it lacks a culture of law. And then we also know that nobody has a monopoly on the phrase rule of law. And for that, I point to Xi Jinping, China's leader. He published a manifesto, and here's what he called it. Xi Jinping's thought on rule of law. So I'll let you judge that one for yourself. But over time, I think scholars and others have come to a more nuanced view of what do we mean by rule of law. So as a benchmark, I'm going to use the definition that's proffered by the World Justice Project. And in the interest of full disclaimer, I am a board member of the World Justice Project. But we say that rule of law is captured by 4 universal principles. 1, accountability. 2, just laws. 3, open government. And then 4th, accessible and impartial justice, all of which are important. And they're more important than just saying I have a constitution or I have a laws or we're an open government. They really require governments to put these in action. I want to go back in time because this, I think, helps place where we are today. And maybe even some of our audience will resonate with the timing of this timeline. Okay, World War II. We had an incredible sense of confidence after World War II and optimism that democracy would be expanded across the globe. We all recall the Nuremberg trials, and they were really seen as a watershed event in international law and vindication of human rights. So of course we had that great optimism, and then it was shattered with the coming of the Cold War and this rise of the geopolitical and ideological tension between the 2 superpowers, our country, the United States, and Russia. So it's interesting that this freeze, which I say here is the Cold War, it lasted almost 44 years. So that is a very long time after all this optimism. And then, of course, it fell apart, that freeze, when the Berlin Wall came down, 1989. So in the 90s, we had really what we thought were overthrowing of a lot of governments in the Eastern Bloc. And there's kind of giddiness and euphoria again, similar to after World War II. But interestingly, this decommunization did not lead inexorably to democracy. And that may seem like a contradiction. So yes, there were a lot of liberal democracies that expanded, but some countries became failed states or were seized by authoritarian regimes. So here we are now, the 21st century, and we have a number of new challenges. First and foremost, the rise of China as a decidedly authoritarian state, and what I call both democratic and judicial backsliding. So I then say to you, well, what is the state of the rule of law today? And I wish I could give you a report card that would make any parent happy, but that's not the case. In fact, there's a wonderful international scholar at the University of Virginia, and he basically says that the 21st century is where the hopes of the 1990s went to die. So I can't help but agree with him in part. We're kind of in this situation where we have a global rule of law recession, and we have increased prevalence of authoritarian governments. So let me look at a couple of charts to give you a sense. This is produced by the World Justice Project. And interestingly, in the last 5 years, 65% of the countries that have been monitored have shown a decline. Of course, dark green is really good. Light green is not bad. United States. As you get toward red and yellow, basically those countries are in trouble. And, it's no surprise, I think, that the vast majority of countries fall at the low end of the scale, as well as these basically 4.4 billion people who live underneath a crumbling rule of law system. So then I'll show you what the rankings are. And I don't think they're in a big surprise, except one exception, and that's the United States. So you're going to look at that chart and you're going to say, top 10, where's the United States? Well, basically, it's not too far behind, but we were ranked lower because of criminal justice issues, access to our courts in civil cases, and also perceived discrimination in multiple categories. So where we look at the bottom countries, those countries are also most at risk in terms of the judiciary being at risk, and also internet crackdown, which I want to talk about. So we look ahead. We look at 140 countries that are surveyed every year by the World Justice Project. And you then say, well, what are the challenges? I don't want to be too depressing, but I think they're kind of bottomless. Of course, migration, discrimination, climate change, nuclear war, plague, famine, pandemics, and more. So I'm going to just look at two of the challenges that I think might be of interest to you. One is what I call kind of the heavy hand, the big thumb on the scale of the judicial branch by legislatures and the executive. And two has to do with the double-edged sword of the internet. Now, these are not unrelated. So when you see governments that start to impose more and more control over the judiciary, curb judicial independence, at the same time, many of those governments are also cracking down on internet freedom because it's a threat to their controlling power. And that is really this kind of integrated relationship. So, lately you'll read in the news that it's the rise of authoritarian governments that has led to this fissure in the rule of law, whereas democratic regimes are good and they uphold the rule of law. But I think it's a mistake to rest the argument on this dichotomy of authoritarianism on one hand and democracy on the other. And why? Because we've seen both kinds of regimes, both democratic and authoritarian, invade the judiciary and invade the separation of powers. So in principle, over many years, we've thought of the judiciary as playing a central role as a check on executive power. And I think that remains true. And it's also been a beacon and a buffer against arbitrary and unchecked power. I thought that what Justice Kagan of the Supreme Court said was interesting because she highlighted that much of our judicial legitimacy comes from being an institution that balances the political branches. But I have to go back to the founding of the country and Alexander Hamilton. And he really, all of this is kind of played out, of course, in the play Hamilton as well. But here's what he said about the judiciary. He said, the judiciary doesn't have power over either the sword or the purse. In other words, we don't control the military and we don't control the money. And the only thing we have is judgment. So when we have the governments invading that judgment, then the judiciary is at risk. So I want to give you, a few examples or vignettes that are taking place across the globe. Take their Tunisia. When we had the Arab Spring, Tunisia was really a bright spot for democracy. Now we're 10 years down the road or more, and it's actually now called a work in progress as far as democracy. So I was fortunate to go to Tunisia twice to work with the judges, and there was a lot of euphoria and high spirits about the judges being able to be independent. But all those hopes, in my view, have now been dashed. Not long ago, you have Tunisia. You have a democratically elected government, President Said. So what he decided to do was dissolve the Judicial Council, which governs the judiciary, and he even shut down the Supreme Court building so they couldn't decide any cases. That wasn't enough. Then he dismissed 57 judges and prosecutors. And just last year, I was at an international judicial meeting where the Tunisian judiciary was going to get an award. They had been warned by the government, do not go to that meeting. There will be consequences. So it was with a lot of pride and respect when they actually came to the meeting and received the award, because they said if they didn't do it, then there would be nothing to push back against the government. Hong Kong, of course, we've all seen the press about Hong Kong, and democracy advocates are flexing their muscle there. At the same time, you've got Beijing, and they issue interpretations about Hong Kong law. They basically said the executive in Hong Kong, appointed, of course, by Beijing, has the power to overturn court decisions. They've now banned foreign lawyers, and the chief executive actually gets to pick the judges who are going to serve as trial judges. So basically, lawyers are fleeing Hong Kong. And at the same time, we have these protests, and many people have been arrested. But true to form, here's what the government says. Hong Kong prides itself on the rule of law. So again, you have a repressive government that invokes rule of law. And Hong Kong used to be really a crown jewel in the international judicial arena. It's changed a lot now. Now there's this ongoing trial, the largest ever, of so many protesters being accused in a national security proceeding, saying that they are terrorists. So I think Hong Kong is a great illustration of this difference between rule of law, which we're talking about, and rule by law, which is imposing these really draconian laws. Then you've got Poland. It's really remarkable. This picture is of Polish justices and judges actually protesting when the government cracked down and basically was firing judges, moving them around, facing disciplinary charges and that sort of thing. However, just to show you that not everything is bleak and times can change, in Poland, there's been an election. And after the election, the judiciary has basically been restored to its old position where it is a co-equal branch of government. So this is why we never give up hope. But it's also why we can't say, oh, if it's a democracy, things are good, and if it's authoritarian, things are bad. You really have to kind of dig under and see what's happening. So let's go now to our continent, or down to Latin America, Guatemala. Oh my gosh. It was an evolving democracy for so many years, and it's now rated as a kleptocracy. So basically, there's an alliance between corrupt politicians, drug traffickers, organized crime, and economic groups. So these are various judges, and you can see their courts. The high-risk court, the anti-corruption office, those are courts that prosecute some of the most difficult cases in Guatemala against public officials. And of course, the Constitutional Court, which is really equivalent to our Supreme Court. Well, as of a year or so ago, more than 22 judges have basically just fled Guatemala because their life is at risk and they can't go back. If you look at our index, Guatemala is 110 out of 140 countries, so no surprise. Venezuela, you read a lot about Venezuela, and I'll just share a little anecdote. When I was working with the State Department and the American Bar Association, they wanted me to go down to Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez was the president. He was not communicating with our diplomats or our country, but the judiciary was still considered independent, and so the Venezuelan government permitted me to come. However, it didn't help that the president, right before I went there, called Hugo Chavez a crackpot from Caracas. So I kind of landed at a time when relations weren't very good. And they asked me to do a radio show. And I said, well, I can do that, kind of give me the idea of questions. And they were softball questions. But what they didn't tell me is that there would be a call-in portion of the radio show. So there's this call-in portion. And the first question is, how do you tout rule of law in light of Bush v. Gore? So of course, I wasn't quite prepared for that question. But one thing I said, I have to say, is I said that whether you agreed or disagreed with what the Supreme Court did in the Bush v. Gore ruling, after the election, the certification went forward, people went back to work, there were not big demonstrations, and there was no interruption of our democratic government. I think after the events of January 6th, I couldn't give the same answer because the United States, of course, is not immune to rule of law challenges. Judges have been labeled so-called judges. They've been personally attacked. There's very significant judicial security issues. So while we're not here for a popularity contest, and it's totally fair game to criticize and attack our rulings, but I think when the institution is attacked and when the public begins to think the institution doesn't have any credibility and that it's under siege, then I think that really goes to the heart of democracy. So let me go now to the second point, and that is the internet, what I call a double-edged sword. Okay, think back to the mid-90s. We're just getting the internet as a common resource. 18 million Americans are connected. We now have almost 5 billion users on the internet. So it was a new technology and it was really celebrated. It would democratize community networking, political movements. And on a global scale, it would be a foundation for citizens to really join a global democracy agenda. Well, all of that is true, but it also has underpinnings of, at the same time, there's the double edge. So I'm not going to debate the pros and cons of the internet, except to say that all the things that made the internet quickly popular also made them downside if you were with an authoritarian or a repressive regime. So governments are now just as adept as internet activists in harnessing the power of the internet. For more than a decade, Freedom House, it's a global nonprofit headquartered in DC, has undertaken this study of global internet freedom. And their conclusion is that for the 12th year, it's been declining. And what we've seen is that digital repression follows political repression. So when there's a military action, like in Russia, Sudan, or Myanmar, then, or Hungary, you also have the government coming in and restricting rights on the internet. So the kind of things that happen in terms of restricting rights are blocking foreign websites, blocking social media, restricting new kind of technology, and criminalizing internet usage. So it's kind of interesting here that only 18% of the world's countries are considered free, and just add to that only partially free, 34%. So that's fairly significant. Now China, well, there's the Internet Freedom Rankings that I think you should see. They're no surprise. Iceland, Estonia, which they call Estonia for all of its electronic and internet work. Taiwan, Canada, and the United States does fall a little bit behind here, but it's still in the very top rankings. But again, look at the ones on the bottom 10, and every one of those you say there's some kind of political upheaval or political repression. So of course you see China is the very bottom. If you've ever been in China and you took your device and were hoping that you wouldn't be hacked, you would also find you couldn't go on to various internet sites. And here's some of the common ones, like Messenger, Twitter, Google, all the news media like the New York Times, the Post, the Financial Times. And Russia's really no different. They have blocked Facebook and Twitter and new uploads to TikTok. So that was mostly seen as a retaliation against these US platforms and US news outlets. But the reality was that it's been played out for the citizens. And Ukraine has just exacerbated the situation in Russia. There was a university student, for example, and she posted a couple of pretty modest, not hot-headed critiques on social media about the war in Ukraine. So what happened to her? She was arrested for justifying terrorism and also discrediting the Russian military. They put her under house arrest, but she was looking at a very long sentence and she realized she couldn't stand Russia. So there was a college student kind of in the prime of her life. She had to flee to Lithuania. So, again, this troubling phenomenon of what's happening on the internet, I think is something that should concern us all. Of course, the internet is no panacea to everything. We've got challenges because of privacy, hate speech, and of course, there's a fracturing along national borders. When one country tries to regulate the internet, very hard to do because the internet servers are not like in cyberspace or somewhere up there that can't be reached. They are physical on the ground somewhere. And I think the European Union has been the most effective because it's put in rules about regulating internet freedom and speech that realistically US companies have to follow. So what does all this mean? Well, I don't think it means anything good for the rule of law. We have all these limits on information access. We have government surveillance, and then we have vulnerability of private data. And so now that's led governments to basically up the ante and imprison human rights and internet activists. So I would say that's probably, to me, one of the most serious concerns about the internet, and that is specific laws that criminalize the internet. Here's just a few examples. If you criticize the government in China, you go to prison for 18 years. Or somebody in Iran was executed. Somebody in Egypt, 10 years. A Saudi woman, 34 years. And I could give you hundreds of examples of laws that are intended to, quote, protect the executive where citizens can't even say anything negative, and some of it's pretty mild, frankly, or they'll go to jail. So you can imagine how that chills speech on the internet. And in one case in Nicaragua, they sentenced someone to 9 years. He ultimately was released as a political prisoner and deported to the United States. But most citizens are not that lucky. So this is really what I think is one of the really concerning things about the internet. So, okay, we have all this bad news I've given you, and you wonder, well, why, would I spend time in my free time, what limited there is, to work with governments and judiciaries across the country. And, certainly my colleagues, my friends, and definitely my family is wondering, oh, there you go again. I was just in Colombia working on human trafficking there. So why have I done this? Well, I've thought a lot about it, and I'll just give you one reason. And that is my friend Mehmet. I met Mehmet many years ago at an international judicial meeting, and he was very big on judicial independence. He wrote articles on it, what it meant internationally, really very benign. And even more benign, he was a tax judge. He wasn't a judge like the ones in Guatemala who hear profile and terrorist cases. He didn't even hear regular criminal cases. He was a tax judge. And so there's his tweet in 2016. And he's telling me that Turkey has issued arrest warrants for 2,700 judges, prosecutors, professors, including him. It turned out that the Turkish government said, no, actually there were 4,000, including the sacking of many university professors. So what's happened is he had a trial, which was very much not much of a trial. It was monitored by the US government and national and international observers. And, he basically was sentenced to almost 7 years in prison. As a result, he lost his house. So his family, he had a brand new baby. I was there maybe 6 months before this happened. Brand new baby, 2 children, a wife. She couldn't get a job. So now they have 3 people, children. They have a family, can't get a job, and she has to go live with her parents. But of course, the Turkish economy is in a free fall, and it's very, very difficult to survive. When many of them were let out, and many of them are still there, they couldn't get their jobs back. They couldn't use their law degree. So instead, what were they doing? Basically, equivalent of Uber driver or clerking in a grocery store. So I then had incredible news in 2023 when I got a text from Mehmet, and he was in Switzerland during a very small window in which he'd been released from prison, but he had still a pending appeal. The government didn't block his leaving. He fled to Switzerland, and he's applied for asylum there. And I keep in close touch with him and his family. They lived in a refugee camp for quite a while, and now they live in a very modest kind of apartment. And he's trying to basically reconstruct his life. So for me, that's the reason that I think about these issues and spend time. But of course, I have no panacea for how you're going to get all this back on track. Many scholars have looked at this, including several at UCSD, Emily Hafner-Burton, Steph Haggard, and others. But I offer just a couple of comments before closing. One is you can't really de-link the rule of law from the economy or the private sector. It doesn't just stand out there as something that the judiciary does. So it's not just the province of government or nonprofits, as we call them, non-governmental organizations, as they're called overseas. And, we can't just have sort of a hand-waving solution. I think technology companies need to work with these critics. And of course, we abhor hate speech and disinformation. However, we have to be careful that we don't have these scattershot initiatives that are short-sighted and don't take a long view, and then they might end up backfiring in the short term. So I would think, in my view, Europe's been way out ahead of the United States on how we harmonize the internet, what do we do about social media, and also facilitate free speech. It's not a perfect solution, but at least they have enacted the equivalent of proposals that have been adopted. And also, while I'll say that I think institution building is great, what we've really seen lately is what I call a paradigm shift, and that is to what's called people-centered justice. So instead of working with the country and asking, well, what does the government want, or what does it need, or what is the judiciary, the question has been flipped. What do the people on the ground need? So recently, the US State Department has adopted this approach, and organizations that I've worked with, the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative and the World Justice Project, Lawyers Without Borders, they've really long incorporated these principles. But I think there is a shifting emphasis, and I think it'll be interesting to see where these initiatives go. In my view, the judiciary still remains the bulwark against arbitrary and capricious conduct by the other branches of government. So what we need to do, of course, is strengthen the judge's resolve, personal resolve, against corruption, and in an effort to support transparent decision-making. And I think that in many ways, making sure that judges around the world and judicial networks are really cheerleaders and mentors and sounding boards for judges who are in these threatened countries. I've gotten incredible pleasure in the last year and a half being a mentor to an Afghan judge. She's 32 years old. She escaped under fire in those early days when we withdrew our troops, and she's finally landed at Berkeley. And she'll graduate this year with a master's in law from Berkeley. So that's a very positive story, but there's a long road ahead for her. It just reinforces that for me, there's really, no substitute for personal judicial diplomacy. And with that, I'll conclude. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to take those. And I think that Barbara will be monitoring the chat and also people who raise their hand.
Well, at this moment, I just want to say thank you so much, Judge McKeown, for a very stimulating and amazing view of what is going on in the world and locally and where we stand. You've stimulated an immediate question, and I'd like to call on Rich. Rich, would you care to, would you please unmute yourself and present your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Judge. That was very, very interesting. I kind of wanted to get your perspective on our Supreme Court and the perception that, there are those, and I'm not advocating either party here or any organization, but, there's a perception that there is sort of a thumb been put on the scales of the court, and it's diminished its credibility in some folks' eyes. And I'd like to get your comments on whether you think that's valid, or what the risks around that are, just your general feelings. And again, thank you so much for a very stimulating presentation. I much appreciate
Sure. Well,
it.
thank you for the question. As you can appreciate, I have to tread fairly lightly, as those are the folks that grade my papers. And the Ninth Circuit and other circuit courts, we're the last stop before the Supreme Court. Together, we have around 50,000 some cases. The Supreme Court every year is deciding only 60, so a very small number. But I think you're right. I think from a public perception, at least as documented by surveys and others, there has been a declining sense and commitment in the Supreme Court. That said, it still ranks significantly higher than Congress or the executive branch. And Justice Breyer, who just retired, and he and I co-chair the ABA Rule of Law Initiative, he had a book, not long ago, basically saying, well, the Supreme Court's not political. It kind of depends on what you mean political. I think Justice Kagan has been really pretty forthright to say that there are tensions in the court, and you have to navigate those. Some might come from background and politics, and some come from other views, like how do you interpret the Constitution? So I think she's been candid in acknowledging those tensions. But at the same time, we've recently seen a kind of a national speaking tour of Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Sotomayor talking about the friendships. And we all know that Justice Scalia was very close friends with Justice Ginsburg. So sort of these backgrounds make strange bedfellows sometimes, and it may contribute to how the conversation goes. So I think that the Supreme Court, like all of us, we don't close our eyes to news reports about what's being said, but we have to have some faith that they are interpreting either the statute or the Constitution, consistent with their view of statutory or constitutional construction. And there's not a uniformity in terms of that.
Wonderful question and a very important answer there. We also have a question here now from Liz, who has said, in the rule of law index ratings, the UK wasn't listed. Does that mean that the UK is below Ireland, for example?
It wasn't listed in the top 10, very astute reading of the chart. But like the United States, there's a number of issues. As you know, there's a lot of surveillance in the UK and cameras everywhere. And that, I think, has contributed to some of the diminishment in the rule of law, and also some of the government's approach to combating terrorism. And so that's why I think it's a little below, but it is definitely in the high group of countries that are highly performing, highly democratic.
Well, that Liz, do you want to, thank you, Liz. I think that was a great question and a very fascinating answer. Looks like Mary has her hand up too. So Mary, are you unmuted? And please go.
Yes, I was just curious that, when I think of a country that the people have no democracy or rights at all, I think of North Korea, where there's no access to the internet, where you could be literally sentenced to death for watching one of the popular dramas from South Korea, and a total dictatorship. And I was just curious why, with the bottom group on both those lists, unless North Korea is just in a category all by itself.
Well, again, here I am in a university audience, which is a very careful reading and smart audience. So those are great perceptions. Our rule of law index includes huge amounts of one-to-one surveys with people, not just digital surveys. And you might imagine we are not in North Korea. There's a few countries we're not in, but North Korea is one of them. But I think you have hit the nail on the head. It's another country where criticizing the government can get you executed. And, they do different things there that help balkanize the internet. Number one, they block incoming foreign traffic, and China does that to a degree. So they block traffic. They also throttle the internet and slow things down in different locations. They monitor if there's the slightest protest, of which there have been very few, and boom, internet there is basically cabined. So North Korea is a good example, but one that we haven't been able to access.
I see. Thank you.
Good question, and interesting to understand more about the methodology. Quite understandable that you couldn't access North Korea with the kind of survey work you're doing, and that does reflect on what you were able to present.
Yeah, we have, we've refined the survey instruments over the years, and we have several academics that are full-time staff members of the World Justice Project. So the index itself is a kind of highly academic exercise. And then the data coming from the index is turned into plain English, we hope, so that we can look at, what does all that mean? But, I should have actually put up here the World Justice Project.org. You can go into the index and you can pick a country, and then you can go under different layers and look and look and look. So it's a really interesting exercise when you're interested in a country. And if I travel to a country, I'll often take a look, what's happening here. I mean, Vietnam is another one where many people have traveled to Vietnam. It is a communist country. We see a lot of capitalism in the commercial arena, but you still see a fair control in, say, for example, the internet arena with Vietnam. But in general, I don't think visitors necessarily feel that. So everybody comes back from Vietnam and says, whoa, what an amazing trip. And it is. It's an amazing country that's made incredible strides, particularly in the economic arena. But you have to remember that it's still got the unitary government, with the executive having a really, really strong hand.
Well, very interesting. And this World Justice Project, by its very existence, focuses on these important issues and gives access to what is known and what is not known. So that's really fascinating. I'd like to ask a question. While others of you may be thinking of your questions, you mentioned that Europe is doing a really good job, or relatively good job. Could you specify a little bit about more what Europe is doing that you think is worth looking at in more detail?
Yeah, well, one of the first things they did, and it's been like a decade in the making, was create a privacy law. And there were all kind of requirements for companies and people operating in Europe to abide by protecting personal data. So they were way ahead of us. If you read the news now, everybody's all over privacy. We have no federal privacy law, which is amazing. There is this European privacy law, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. But because it protects data of people in Europe, and because US companies do business with people in Europe, there's now been this protocol for how US businesses can comply with the law. Because, people in Europe have .gmail accounts. They might also have .fr. But if you just went to the .fr accounts, France, you would miss all kinds of other people in the European community. So the European Union adopts these broad rules, and then country by country they adopt them. But they've adopted rules in copyright, also in a general commercial and antitrust directive. So they've been very active in the last years, and they were the first really to crack down on US companies. So you saw the headlines of Microsoft fined X million dollars for a data breach, or Facebook such and such. So they also have a very active enforcement mechanism.
So that the rule and the enforcement are an important combination,
Right.
As a model.
Right.
Do you see any progress for the US moving in that direction at this time?
Well, there's now, it's a great question, because there's a big movement now for us to adopt federal privacy law, because there's been so much concern about privacy. We
Mhm.
have in the Constitution the Fourth Amendment,
Mhm.
which basically means that your papers and your home and your person can't be invaded, without a warrant and unreasonably. But that's fairly narrow and, mostly related to criminal law. What's being touted now, and there's a lot of congressional support, my understanding, is really to have a national privacy law. I should mention that California is totally out front on this. California enacted a privacy law related to minors. It also enacted what we call the erase button. And that is, a lot of young people put stuff on social media that they might later regret. And it permits young people at a certain age to be able to go back and, quote, erase it. Now, that's not 100% practical, as we know, but it does provide, some relief. And every time, California is out adopting another law related to privacy, the question is, does that conflict with something the federal government is doing? But since there's no big privacy law to look to, we do have specific privacy laws, what I call sector, like banking. So of course your banking records are confidential, and health.
Mhm.
So those are two areas people are very invested in, but they're very directed to those particular sectors. And we've had those laws for quite a long time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, I think the health, when we go to an appointment, at UCSD or elsewhere, and they say, stand behind the line because for privacy reasons. And then you sign a privacy notice, which nobody reads, of course. But were there to be a breach, then, that privacy notice might, have some value. But a lot of people say, yeah, sign. Behind the line, no, that was COVID. I'm just going right up to the desk right now. So that's an example where a small part of the privacy law kind of makes people belittle what is a bigger part of, and that is actually trying to protect your medical records. And there have been a breach or two that you've read about, some in San Diego and some nationally. And those are very concerning, and the government comes down pretty hard on those companies.
Yes, and I know I'm more familiar with the health side, and that's taken very seriously
Right.
inside the medical profession. Very, very, very interesting. I have one more question, or many more questions, but I want to make sure that other people have a chance to ask some questions as well. So please go ahead. I'm going to jump in and ask another question, and that has to do with disinformation on the internet and balancing out. And what are your thoughts about balancing the power of the disinformation, particularly at this point in time as we get into a political season, versus freedom? And is there a remedy that you think that might be effective somewhere along the line?
Well, I can't really comment on specific remedies because when all these laws come to us, we are ruling constantly on the constitutionality of any of these efforts. One thing I would say is watch the Supreme Court this year. Their final decisions will come out at the end of June. And there's two big internet cases. And they relate to whether, for example, the government could order somebody to take down some posting on the internet. And we have two different circuit courts. This one doesn't involve our circuit, that came out different ways. So that'll be very interesting. I think everyone is looking for a way to curb disinformation. But how do you curb disinformation if you can't do it, at the expense of free speech? And that's this hat trick that Congress is struggling with. I think we would all agree that we don't like hate speech.
Mhm,
In Europe, that's another example. They have very specific hate speech laws.
mhm, mhm,
We
mhm.
have hate speech crimes. So you shoot somebody or do something motivated by hate, you could be arrested for a hate crime. But we really don't have statutes that would arrest you for saying things. And, it's not just fire in a crowded theater, but, many times during the McCarthy era and others where they cracked down on speech, most of those rulings have been overturned over time. So our question always is how we value this huge First Amendment
Mhm,
that I think is so important to the United States and our history
mhm.
with what's happening now. And, hate speech is just a really good example. I wrote an article with a friend of mine in Europe about really the differences between the United States and Europe on hate speech. You also see that come up in connection with schools.
Mhm,
The
mhm.
principals have to deal with students and hate speech. Students, in the secondary arena, there's much more ability for the principals to regulate those. But as you get into the university section and the older students, and not in a public secondary school, then it gets a lot dicier as to how do you balance First Amendment rights and something else. Now, if there is a threat, if there are major, physical concerns, then you start to be able to potentially do something, but not always. So I don't want to comment on what's happening now, except to say different universities have used different approaches, and we have to really kind of stand back and see, well, where does all of this go? Because it kind of highlights speech and US free speech. And, we have other countries that follow our general free speech, Australia, New Zealand, others, but they are a little more willing than the United States to put restrictions on it. So I think Congress is looking at a lot of very interesting initiatives on what we can do. And it's not really speech in general, it's really speech on the internet,
Mhm, mhm.
because disinformation takes on a new kind of arena when you're on the internet, as opposed to, if I just go to Hyde Park and stand on the corner and spout my views. So I think that's why I say the internet has been such a huge game changer for all of us.
Right, the amplification of and the quick amplification with
Yes.
the opportunity for a back and forth exchange. What you've just said seems to highlight one of the other points that you've made, and the importance of the person-to-person interaction of on the Supreme Court, on the kind of work that you're doing with colleagues around the world, um, the opportunity to have those kinds of interactions seem to be even more important than ever.
Right. Well, I agree. Like everybody, I start out, I want to save the world, etc. I'm now feeling like if I could make an impact on one family, one judiciary, one person, that it's worth doing. But there are structural changes that we at the American Bar and others have looked at in the judiciary and other aspects that I think, would make structural changes in all these areas. But you can't get too discouraged, in my view, that you can't make all those kind of changes, when in fact you can actually see some of the grassroots and on the ground changes.
Right, and that they lead, it's incremental often, and it sets the stage and paves the way and looks at different avenues that wouldn't otherwise be apparent.
Right.
Just from a personal perspective, I cannot thank you enough, and I know others would join me in this, but I think we have another question, or please, Charlotte.
Oh, it's in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Um, is there a chance Congress can find a way to limit conspiracy theorists working in government in view of the First Amendment?
Ah,
That's
that's
an interesting question.
That's a great question, but you may remember back in time where we were trying to limit communists working in the government, and it didn't go so well in terms of, some of those limitations. I really can't say on this. Like all these things, the way we look at it is if you pass a statute or we're looking at the Constitution, we look at the whole thing. We look at it in conjunction with other laws, related laws, then we look back to our precedent. And that's certainly something that distinguishes the United States and the common law countries from Europe and others. We have, 200 years of precedent that we look at. It does get overruled sometimes, but many of the other countries are pure rule-based, and they don't really have that history that they're drawing on. So it's a very different way to look at a law. And because they have, some countries, no constitution, Europe tried to adopt a constitution. It was 500 pages long, and then it basically fell into the garbage can. So some of them don't have some of the same historical guardrails, that we have. So very, very different. But I think what you're thinking of is what many people are thinking of. Are there things that could be done on a grassroots level, on a more granular level? And I think that's something that a lot of policymakers, are thinking about. In that regard, we're reactive in the courts. In other words, we don't write the laws. We interpret them, and we don't enforce them either. But our role is to provide a constitutional or a statutory interpretation.
And the judgment, the fairness that you were describing
Right.
as you started your remarks.
Yeah, and there can be cases where I don't agree with the law, but if that's what the law says, then, I've taken an oath to be fair, and not to try to override the law. And so that is just the everyday meat and potatoes of our life and our job, that if you get to a point where you can't uphold the law, then maybe it's time to get another job.
Thank you.
Well, we're very grateful to you for doing your job, you and your colleagues. Thank you so very, very much, Judge McKeown. This has been such a stimulating and informative presentation, and I know it's going to have an impact beyond those of us present. And I see some hands clapping on the tiles as well as in person. So just thank you, and thank you, everyone. This has just been fantastic.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I really love the questions, because it really makes me think about these things. So these questions are fantastic, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. So gracious. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Judge.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stopping the recording.